I spent my whole life building an empire, not for myself, but for my only son, whom I love more than life itself. But one cold December evening, in front of 20 dinner guests, my son looked me straight in the eye and said I had to pay rent if I wanted to continue staying in his apartment. His wife laughed. The guests fell silent. And I, the woman who had built everything around them, just stood up, nodded, and smiled. Because I knew something no one in that room knew. Please comment the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has come. And don't leave. Because this story doesn't end here. I remember the exact moment I realized my son had become a stranger. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't the kind of slow drift you tell yourself you can fix with one more phone call, one more visit, one more chance. It happened in a single breath, on a Tuesday evening in December, with snow coming down outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of a penthouse that I had quietly purchased for him 4 years ago, though he had conveniently forgotten that detail by now. There were 20 people at that dinner table, business associates, neighbors from the building, a few couples I recognized from the charity galas Nathan liked to attend with his wife, Victoria, the two of them moving through those rooms like they were born into money rather than handed it by a woman who used to pack her own lunch in a paper bag to save $12 a week. I had arrived that evening the way I always did, quietly, with a dish I'd made myself, a sweet potato casserole that Nathan used to beg me to bring to every holiday meal when he was a child. I carried it up in the elevator with both hands, the foil warm against my palms, thinking maybe tonight would be a good night, thinking that maybe the tension I'd been feeling for months was something I was imagining. I was not imagining it. I set the casserole on the kitchen counter and walked into the dining room, and Victoria looked at it the way you look at something that doesn't belong in a clean house. She didn't say anything. She just looked. And that look, that small, practiced expression of tolerant distaste, told me everything about what was coming before a single word was spoken. Dinner was beautiful, the way expensive things often are. The table was set with white candles and charcoal linen napkins, and a centerpiece of winter flowers I recognized from the florist on Michigan Avenue that charged $300 for a simple arrangement. There was wine that cost more per bottle than my first monthly paycheck had. Nathan sat at the head of the table like a man who had built all of this with his own two hands, and I watched him laugh at his own stories, and I ate my food, and I told myself to be patient. I'd been telling myself to be patient for 3 years. The dinner went on. The conversation was the kind that wealthy people have when they want to perform their wealth. References to recent travel, to renovations, to investments, to things they were thinking of buying. I participated where I could. I smiled when it was appropriate. I was, as I had always been, careful not to embarrass him. It was after the main course was cleared when Nathan set down his wine glass and looked at me across the table. Not at me the way a son looks at his mother. At me the way an employer looks at an employee who has overstayed their welcome. "Mom," he said, and there was something in his voice I had never heard before. A measured, careful tone, like he'd rehearsed this, like he'd been sitting on it for weeks and had finally decided tonight was the night. "Victoria and I have been talking." I set down my fork. Not dramatically, just quietly. "We've been talking about the living arrangements," he continued. "You've been staying in the guest suite pretty regularly, and we want to be clear about expectations going forward." I looked at him. I waited. "We think it's fair if you start contributing to the cost of the suite when you stay over. A monthly arrangement, nothing unreasonable." He named a figure. It was not a small figure. It was the kind of number that would strain the budget of most retired women living on savings and a pension. He thought I was that woman. For a moment, the entire table went still. I could feel it. That particular social discomfort that descends on a room when someone has said something that cannot be unsaid. The couple to my left exchanged a glance so fast they probably thought I didn't catch it. The man across from me suddenly found something very interesting in his wine glass. Victoria reached over and touched Nathan's hand. Not in a way that suggested she was reining him in a way that suggested she was proud of him for finally saying it. "You understand, Evelyn," she said. "Evelyn, not Mom, not even a courtesy title. Evelyn, the way you address a contractor or a landlord. We have a life here. We can't just have the space used indefinitely without some kind of arrangement. It's not personal. It's just practical." Practical. I looked at my daughter-in-law's face. She was 34 years old. She had never held a job that lasted longer than 8 months. When she married Nathan 6 years ago, I bought her wedding dress because Nathan had asked me to, and I had said yes because I thought it would bring us closer together. The dress cost more than I used to make in a month. I had not been thanked for it once, and now she was sitting in a penthouse that I owned, at a table my money had paid for, wearing a diamond ring that Nathan had purchased with a company card tied to my accounts, telling me that my occasional use of a guest suite I had furnished myself was a financial imposition. The room was still quiet. I understood then that nobody at that table was going to say anything, not because they didn't know it was wrong, but because wealthy rooms have a particular kind of cowardice built into them. Everyone is too concerned with their own standing to risk it for someone else's dignity. So I was on my own, which, if I'm being honest, was not a new feeling. I took a breath. I picked up my napkin, folded it once, and set it beside my plate. Then I looked at my son, this man I had driven to soccer practice in a car with a broken heater. This man I had held on a hospital cot through 3 nights of pneumonia when he was 9 years old. This man whose college applications I had proofread at midnight after 12-hour shifts. And I said very calmly, "You're right. No one should take luxury for granted." Nathan nodded, relieved, like he thought that meant I was accepting the terms, like he thought the conversation was over, and he'd handled it cleanly. He had no idea it had barely begun. I have not always been a woman with power. I want to be clear about that because this story is not about someone who had it easy and got careless. This is about someone who had nothing and built something, brick by brick, decision by decision, over 40 years of choices that nobody applauded at the time. My name is Evelyn Whitmore. I am 70 years old. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house in rural Indiana with a father who worked at a grain elevator and a mother who cleaned other people's homes 3 days a week. We were not poor by the definitions people use when they want to sound dramatic, but we were careful. Every dollar was accounted for. Every expense was deliberate. There was no room for waste, and there was no room for the kind of carelessness that comes from never having to think about money. I thought about money constantly, not because I was greedy, because I understood from the time I was 12 years old watching my mother's hands in someone else's kitchen that financial dependence was a particular kind of vulnerability, one that could be used against you without warning by people you trusted completely. I married Robert Whitmore when I was 26. He was a good man, a kind man, someone who believed in me before I had given him much evidence to justify that belief. We built our early life together on 2 modest incomes and a shared stubbornness about not spending what we hadn't earned. Robert drove trucks. I worked logistics dispatch for a regional freight company, and I was good at it in a way that surprised my supervisors, who had expected someone to answer phones and file papers and not ask too many questions. I asked questions constantly. I wanted to know why certain routes were inefficient, why certain contracts were renewed with vendors who consistently underdelivered, why the company was losing money on distribution channels that a few structural changes could have fixed. My supervisors were patient with me at first, then annoyed, then, when the changes I suggested actually worked, quietly resentful that a dispatcher had figured out what their management teams had missed. I filed that information away. I kept learning. When Nathan was 3 years old, Robert and I took out a second mortgage on our house, and I started a small freight brokerage out of our basement. It was not glamorous. It was 2 phones, a folding table, a computer that crashed constantly, and me working until 2 in the morning after Nathan was in bed, building relationships with carriers and shippers, 1 call at a time. Robert believed in me so completely that it sometimes frightened me. He never once suggested I was being unrealistic. He never once said we should be careful, we should slow down, we should play it safe. He just kept driving his routes during the day and making dinner when he got home and telling Nathan bedtime stories while I worked, and that quiet constancy was the foundation everything else was built on. Whitmore Global Freight became real over the course of a decade that I would not wish on anyone and would not trade for anything. There were years we almost lost it. There were contracts that fell through at the last moment. There were employees I had to let go during a stretch that still bothers me when I think about it too hard. There were nights I sat at that folding table in the basement and genuinely did not know if we were going to make it to the next quarter. But we did. Every time we did. By the time Nathan was finishing high school, Whitmore Global Freight had regional contracts with 4 major manufacturers and was moving toward national expansion. By the time he graduated college, we were among the 20 largest privately held freight companies in the country. Robert had retired from driving by then, his knees finally giving out after years of climbing in and out of cabs, and he had become my unofficial sounding board, sitting across from me at what was now a proper desk and a proper office, and telling me when he thought I was making a mistake and being right about it more often than I liked to admit. Robert died of a heart attack on a Wednesday morning in March, 11 years ago. He was 63 years old. I sat with him at the hospital for 4 hours before he was gone, and I held his hand through most of it. And when it was over, I drove home and sat in our kitchen until dawn because I could not think of anywhere else to go. Nathan flew in that evening. He was 29, already working in the company, already beginning to develop the habits of a man who mistakes access for achievement. He hugged me at the airport and he cried genuinely. And for a while after that, we were close in the way grief sometimes makes people close before they drift back into their own lives. I grieved Robert for a long time. I am still grieving him, if I am being honest, in the quiet ways you grieve someone whose absence reshapes the entire texture of your daily life. But grief did not stop me from making decisions. It never had. The decision I made in the year after Robert died was one I have spent a long time reconsidering, and I'm still not sure whether it was the right one or simply the one I could live with at the time. I stepped back. I gave Nathan broader control over a major division of the company. I did it because I thought it was time. I did it because I thought responsibility would teach him the things that comfort had not. I did it because I wanted to believe that the son I had raised would rise to meet the role. And for a while it seemed like he might. The first signs were easy to explain away. Nathan began spending money on things that made no sense as business investments: a corporate suite at a professional sports arena, a membership at a club where the annual fee exceeded what some of our drivers made in a year, a company car that cost more than most people's homes. When I mentioned it, he told me it was about image, about positioning, about the kind of visibility a company at our level needed to maintain. I had built a company at exactly this level. I had never needed any of those things to do it. But I told myself he was learning his own style. I told myself the industry had changed. I told myself a lot of things that were easier than the alternative. Victoria came into the picture 3 years after Robert's death. She was charming in the beginning, genuinely. Funny, self-possessed, with a sharp observational quality that I initially mistook for intelligence and later understood was something closer to calculation. She had grown up in comfortable circumstances, never wanting for much, and she had the particular confidence that comes not from having worked hard, but from having always been provided for. She and Nathan were similar in ways I could not see clearly until much later. After their wedding, the wedding I had largely funded, the dress I had bought, the venue deposit I had quietly covered when Nathan mentioned they were slightly over budget, things began to change. Not immediately, not all at once, but steadily. My visits became less comfortable. The guest suite I used when I stayed over, which I had furnished and maintained at my own expense in an apartment I owned, began to feel like something I was permitted rather than something I was entitled to. Little things. The way Victoria would mention how much she valued their private time. The way Nathan would schedule family dinners and then spend them on his phone. The way my sweet potato casserole stopped showing up at the table and started appearing in the kitchen with a polite note that they'd been trying to keep things to the catered menu. I told myself it was just adjustment. Marriage changes things. Young couples need space. I kept making excuses for them long after I had run out of reasons to. After that dinner, after Nathan's careful speech about practical arrangements and Victoria's steady, confident smile, I walked back to the guest suite and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The suite was quiet. The city was lit up outside the window, all those lights moving below, people living their lives in the cold. I thought about Robert. I thought about the folding table in the basement and the phones ringing and the years of work that had become, in this room, invisible. I was not angry, not yet. I was something quieter than anger and more dangerous. I was clear. I opened my laptop. I stayed up until almost 4 a.m. going through documents I had not looked at in a long time. Ownership records, corporate structures, lease agreements, property holdings. The architecture of everything I had built, all of it quietly present in folders I had maintained with the same careful attention I'd given every other aspect of my business for 4 decades. When I was done reviewing, I sent 3 emails. One to my attorney, Margaret Chen, who had represented me for 22 years and was the only person in my professional life who knew the full picture of my financial holdings. One to the property management company that administered the building Nathan lived in, the building I had purchased outright 8 years ago as a real estate investment and subsequently allowed Nathan to occupy on terms that had never involved him paying a single dollar. And one to the board of Whitmore Global Freight, flagging a governance review I wanted to initiate regarding the division Nathan oversaw. Then I closed the laptop. I went to sleep in the guest suite of my own building for the last time. In the morning, I was gone before anyone else was awake. I left the casserole dish in the kitchen because I was not going to carry it down to the lobby at 5:30 in the morning in December, like someone retreating in shame. I left it because it was my dish and I would retrieve it when I was ready. I took a car to the house I had kept in Evanston, the modest 3-bedroom house Robert and I had bought when Nathan was small, the house I had never sold despite everyone's suggestions that I should, the house that had always felt, in some private and inarticulate way, like the truest version of my life. I made coffee, I sat at my kitchen table, and I began deciding exactly how clearly my son needed to see the truth before he could understand it. The problem with protecting someone from reality for a long time is that eventually, reality has to collect what it's owed. I had been paying that debt on Nathan's behalf for years. It was time for him to settle his own account. The house in Evanston smelled the same as it always had. Old wood, coffee, and something faintly floral from the dried lavender Robert had hung in the kitchen doorway 20 years ago that I had never taken down. I don't know why I never took it down. Maybe because some things are too small to justify keeping and too meaningful to throw away, and you just leave them where they are until they become part of the house itself. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and did not turn on the news. I did not want noise. I wanted the particular silence of a house that had absorbed decades of real life. Arguments over money when Nathan was small, laughter at dinners that weren't catered, the sound of Robert coming through the back door at 6 in the evening, still in his work clothes, calling out that he was home. He was always home. I thought about that while the coffee cooled and the winter light came through the kitchen window at its low December angle, and then I stopped thinking about it because I could not afford to sit in grief when there was work to do. My phone had been ringing since 7:30. I had not answered it. By 9 o'clock, I called Margaret. She picked up on the second ring, which was normal for Margaret. She was one of those people who treated a missed call as a minor personal failure. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you," she said. No preamble, no pleasantries. That was why I had kept her for 22 years. "You saw my email." "I saw all 3 of your emails. I've been at my desk since 6. A pause. "Evelyn, are you sure about the property review?" "I sent the email, didn't I?" Another pause, shorter this time. "I'll need 48 hours to prepare the documentation package. The lease termination notice for the penthouse unit is straightforward. The corporate credit account freeze. I can initiate this morning. The vehicle recall will go through the fleet management company, so give me until end of day on that." I turned my coffee cup in my hands. "And the governance review?" "That's the slower piece. We're talking board-level process. But I can flag it formally this week, which puts Nathan on notice that his divisional authority is under examination." She hesitated. "He'll know something is happening before he understands what." "Good," I said. "Evelyn." Her voice shifted slightly, just enough that I noticed. Margaret was not a soft person, but she knew how to be careful with me without being condescending about it, which was a skill most people never managed. "This is going to be a significant disruption for him and for you. I want to make sure you've thought through what comes after the first 48 hours. I've thought through 40 years of business decisions in this kitchen," I said. "I think I can manage 48 hours. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I'll call you this afternoon." After I hung up, I sat there for another few minutes in the quiet. I was not second-guessing myself. I want to be clear about that, because people tend to assume that when a mother makes a decision that will hurt her child, she must be in some kind of emotional turmoil, some war between love and logic. That is not what I felt. What I felt was the particular steadiness of someone who has delayed a necessary thing for too long and has finally stopped delaying. The turmoil had been living inside me for 3 years, quiet and growing. What happened at that dinner table had not created it. It had simply made pretending impossible. I picked up my phone one more time and scrolled to Nathan's name. His last text to me was from 4 days ago. A single line asking whether I was planning to come to dinner on Tuesday. No other context, no greeting, just the logistical inquiry. I had replied yes. He had not responded to the confirmation. I set the phone down without calling him. He would understand soon enough. What I had never told Nathan, what I had never told anyone outside of Margaret and the 3 members of my inner board, was the precise structure of what I owned. People knew I had founded Whitmore Global Freight. People knew I had built it into something significant. But the specific details of my holdings, the real estate, the investment accounts, the subsidiary structures I had built quietly over the years, those were things I had deliberately kept private, not out of deception, but out of the same instinct that had guided me since that basement in Indiana, the understanding that the safest assets are the ones other people don't know to reach for. Nathan knew I was wealthy. He did not know the extent of it. He had operated for years under the assumption that the company division he ran was the center of the enterprise, that his position there made him the inheritor of something he essentially already controlled. He had stopped asking me questions about the broader financial picture sometime around his 33rd birthday, which was also, not coincidentally, around the time Victoria had come fully into her own as the dominant voice in their household. I had watched that shift happen and said nothing. I had told myself it was their marriage to manage. What I had failed to account for was that a man who stops being curious about where his resources come from is a man who has started to believe he created them himself. The penthouse Nathan lived in was a property I had purchased 8 years ago as part of a real estate portfolio I was building in the downtown corridor. It was a legitimate investment. The building had appreciated considerably, and the rental income from the other units was substantial. Nathan had moved in 2 years after I acquired the building, initially on a temporary basis while he and Victoria were between apartments, and then permanently, by incremental assumption rather than any formal agreement. He had never asked who owned the building. I had never brought it up. Another silence I had allowed to calcify into a kind of fiction. The corporate accounts, the car, the membership fees, the travel expenses, all of it ran through the divisional budget Nathan oversaw, which was technically accurate in the sense that he had authority over that budget, and technically a distortion in the sense that the budget existed because of capital I had allocated from the parent company accounts he had no visibility into. He spent freely, and the money was always there. And like most people in that situation, he had simply stopped thinking about why. I had enabled it. That was the part I had to sit with honestly, and I did sit with it, there at my kitchen table in Evanston, because this story does not have a version where I am entirely without fault. I had made it easy for him to not see clearly. I had cleared every obstacle and then wondered why he never learned to navigate. Robert would have handled it differently. Robert had a directness with Nathan that I had always struggled to match. Not unkind, but unambiguous. He would have sat Nathan down years ago and had the conversation I kept deferring. But Robert was gone, and I had been compensating for his absence in ways I was only now beginning to fully understand. The phone rang at 11:15. Nathan. I let it ring through. A text came 10 minutes later. Mom, can you call me back when you get a chance? Just want to make sure last night didn't come across wrong. We should talk. I read it twice. I noticed the framing. Didn't come across wrong, as though the issue was one of perception rather than content, as though the problem was my interpretation of his words rather than the words themselves. I put the phone face down on the table. No. Margaret called back at 2 in the afternoon. The freeze on the corporate credit accounts went through this morning, she said. Fleet management has initiated the vehicle recall. They'll be contacting Nathan's office tomorrow. The lease termination notice went out an hour ago through the building management company. He'll receive formal written notice by end of day. I was standing at the kitchen window, watching a cardinal work at the bird feeder Robert had installed decades ago. I still kept it filled. I don't know why I kept doing things like that. How will the notice be worded? I asked. Standard lease termination. 60 days. The notice will identify the property owner as Whitmore Property Holdings, LLC. She paused. Which is a name he may or may not recognize. He won't recognize it, I said. He's never asked. A long beat of silence on Margaret's end. She was not a judgmental person, at least not with me, but I could feel her choosing her next words carefully. Evelyn, when he starts making calls to figure out what's happening, the trail is going to lead back to you fairly quickly. I want you to be prepared for the conversation. I'm prepared. He's going to be angry. Yes. He may say things that are hard to hear. Margaret, I said, still watching the cardinal. I was in a room full of people last night while my son asked me to pay rent to sleep in a building I own. I think I've already heard the hard things. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll have the full documentation package ready for you by Thursday. After we hung up, I made a second cup of coffee I didn't need and stood in my kitchen thinking about the first time Nathan had ever disappointed me. Not the small disappointments, the missed phone calls, the forgotten birthdays, the years of taking without noticing. The first real one. He was 16. There was a boy in his class named Marcus who lived 2 streets over. Quiet kid, smart. The kind of child who you could tell was holding a difficult home situation together through sheer will. Nathan and Marcus had been close for a couple of years, the way boys sometimes form unexpected friendships across different circumstances. And then Nathan had started running with a different group. Louder, more careless, kids with money and the particular social confidence that money buys at that age. And Marcus had simply disappeared from our house. I asked Nathan about it once. He shrugged and said Marcus was fine. They'd just grown apart. A month later, I saw Marcus at the grocery store with his mother, and I asked how he was doing, and the way his face arranged itself when I mentioned Nathan's name told me something had happened that was not simply growing apart. I never found out the whole story. Nathan never volunteered it. But I thought about that expression on Marcus's face for a long time afterward, the particular blankness of a kid who has learned to absorb hurt from someone he trusted. And I stored it somewhere in the back of my mind the way you store things you don't know what to do with but can't bring yourself to discard. I was thinking about it now, 34 years later, because I was wondering when exactly the shape of who Nathan was going to become had been decided, and whether there was a version of events where I had seen it clearly enough and early enough to do something different. Maybe. Probably not. Children are not projects you can engineer no matter how carefully you try. They become who they become through 1,000 small choices you are not present for, influenced by forces you cannot control, shaped by the particular alchemy of personality and circumstance, and the things they decide matter. All you can do is try to give them a foundation worth building on. I had given Nathan every possible foundation. What he had built on it was a performance. The call came at 4:17 in the afternoon. I had moved from the kitchen to the small sitting room at the front of the house, the one with the reading chair Robert had refused to let me throw out when we'd talked about redecorating, and I was sitting in it with a book I wasn't reading when the phone lit up with Nathan's name again. This time I answered. Mom. His voice was different from the morning text. The careful, measured tone from the dinner table was gone. What replaced it was something I hadn't heard from him in a long time. Actual alarm, the kind that strips the performance away and leaves whoever is underneath it. I just got a notice from a property management company saying my lease is being terminated. There has to be some kind of mistake. There's no mistake, I said. A beat of silence. What? The notice is accurate. Mom, what? I don't understand. Why am I getting a lease termination from... I heard him shuffling something, paper probably. Whitmore Property Holdings? Who is that? Why is the company sending me a lease notice? I was quiet for a moment. Not cruelly, not dramatically. I was simply deciding how to say the next thing, because the next thing was going to be one of those sentences that divides a life into before and after. Nathan, I said, that company is mine. I own the building. The silence that followed was the longest he had ever given me. You own... He stopped, started again. You own the building. I purchased it 8 years ago. You've been living there on an informal arrangement that was never formalized as a lease. The property management company is operating on my instructions. Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice had changed again, harder now, with something working underneath it that I recognized as the particular anger of a man whose self-image has just been structurally damaged. So this is what? Because of last night? Last night clarified something I should have clarified a long time ago. Mom, I was just trying to have a practical conversation about Nathan. My voice was steady, not raised, not shaking, just level in the way that 40 years of business negotiations teaches you to be level when it matters most. You asked me to pay rent in front of 20 people in a building I own. I think we're past the point of characterizing that as a practical conversation. I heard his breath on the line, shallow, quick. He was trying to recalibrate, I could tell, trying to find the version of this that he could manage, the angle that put him back in a position of some control. The corporate cards aren't working either, he said finally. It came out with a different quality than the rest of it, quieter, more careful, like he was testing how much I knew. I'm aware. And someone from fleet management called the office today about the car. Also aware. Another long pause. When he spoke again, something in his voice had cracked very slightly, just at the edges, in a way I don't think he intended. What are you doing? It was such a simple question, stripped of the performance, stripped of the managed tone he used at dinner parties and board presentations. It was just a man who was frightened, asking his mother what was happening to his life. And I felt it. I want to be honest about that too. I felt the pull of it, the old instinct to soften the blow, to explain it in terms that would make it easier, to find some way to protect him from the full weight of what was coming. The instinct that had been managing his reality for him for 30 years. I did not follow it. I'm letting you see something clearly, I said, for the first time. What does that mean? It means the car belongs to the company. The company belongs to me. The building belongs to me. The accounts belong to the company, which belongs to me. I paused. What belongs to you, Nathan? If you think about it carefully, what have you actually built? The silence this time was different, not the silence of anger or recalibration, something more like the silence of a man standing in a room he thought he knew, realizing the walls are not where he thought they were. I run the division, he said, but even as he said it, the certainty had gone out of it. It was a claim, not a statement, a hand reaching for something to hold. You were given the division, I said gently. You've been managing it with resources I provided, in a building I own, driving a car the company owns, on credit the company extended. I'm not saying you've done nothing, but I am saying that if you removed my name from everything you've been standing on, you would need to look very carefully at what's left. He didn't respond for a long moment. Outside my window, the December light had gone thin and gray, the kind of afternoon that arrives in Chicago like a warning. The cardinal was gone from the feeder. The street was quiet. I need you to reverse this, Nathan said finally. His voice had settled into something flat and controlled, which was somehow worse than the alarm from earlier. Whatever you're doing, the notice, the accounts, I need you to reverse it while we figure this out. Nothing is being reversed, Nathan. Mom, I love you, I said. And I meant it. I meant it with the same fullness I had always meant it, with all 39 years of it behind the words, every night in the hospital, every long shift at the folding table, every quiet decision made in his direction. I love you the same as I always have. That is not what's in question. Then why? Because love is not the same as unlimited provision. Because I have been confusing the two for a very long time, and I think you have too. I took a breath. You told me last night that no one should take luxury for granted. I agree with you. I think it's time you found out what that actually means. I heard him exhale, sharp and ragged, and then the line went quiet in a way that told me he was done speaking. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he didn't yet have language for what was happening to him. The 60-day notice stands, I said. Margaret Chen is handling the documentation. You can contact her office if you have questions about the process." I ended the call. I sat in Robert's chair for a long time afterward, in the thin December light, with the quiet of the house around me. My hands were perfectly still. My coffee was cold. I had just changed the shape of my son's life in a single phone call, and the strangest part of it was not the guilt, which I had expected, or the doubt, which I had prepared for. The strangest part was the grief, not for what I was taking from him, but for all the years I had spent quietly building a version of his life that had never forced him to build anything of his own. That was the part that actually hurt. That was the part I was going to have to sit with for a long time, but sitting with hard things had never stopped me before. And it was not going to stop me now. The 60 days I gave Nathan were not quiet ones. I knew they wouldn't be. I had not expected quiet. I had expected exactly what arrived, which was a sustained campaign of pressure delivered through every channel available to a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted by being persistent enough to exhaust the people around him. Phone calls at hours that suggested he wasn't sleeping well. Texts that started measured and became less so as the days passed. A voicemail from Victoria that I listened to once and then deleted, not because it was painful, but because it was so precisely calculated to seem painful that it made me tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Victoria's voicemail was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. She talked about family, about the stress Nathan was under, about how she had always respected me and hoped we could find a way through this together. She used the word "together" 4 times. She did not apologize for a single thing that had happened at that dinner table. She mentioned toward the end that Nathan had been having some health concerns, unspecified, delivered with just enough vagueness to suggest something serious without committing to any particular claim that could be verified. I had watched Victoria operate for 6 years. I knew exactly what that voicemail was. I did not return it. What I did instead, during those 60 days, was something I had not done in years. I went back to work. Not in the removed advisory capacity I had settled into after stepping back from daily operations, but actually back, sitting in on logistics reviews, meeting with regional managers, going through the divisional financials that Nathan had been overseeing with an attention I had not applied to them in too long. What I found there was the second wave of clarity. The first wave had been personal. The dinner table, the phone call, the long sit in Robert's chair with the cold coffee. The second wave was professional, and in some ways it landed harder because the personal wounds were ones I had been feeling accumulate for years. The professional picture surprised me. Nathan's division was not in crisis. I want to be accurate about this because he was not incompetent in every sense of the word. The basic functions of the division were maintained, the contracts were active. The staff turnover was higher than I would have liked, but the operation was running. What it was not doing was growing. And the reason it was not growing, once I sat with the financials long enough, was that Nathan had been spending money on the appearance of growth rather than the substance of it. The sports suite, the memberships, the entertainment expenses, the elaborate client dinners, all of it was producing exactly the kind of return you get when you confuse visibility with value. The division looked successful from the outside because Nathan had invested heavily in looking successful from the outside. He had learned that part from the wrong place. That one I had to own. There was also something else, buried deep enough in the accounts that I almost missed it, that stopped me cold when I finally saw it clearly. A pattern of expense approvals that ran through a vendor account I didn't recognize. A consulting firm with a corporate address in Delaware and a website that was 3 pages deep with nothing substantive on any of them. The payments were regular. The amounts were significant. The documentation justifying them was thin enough that under any serious audit, it would not survive scrutiny. I did not immediately know what it was. What I knew was that it was wrong. I called Margaret that evening and described what I had found. She was quiet for longer than usual, which from Margaret meant she was thinking through something serious. "I'm going to want to look at this myself before we characterize it," she said carefully. "Send me access to those accounts." "Already done." "Evelyn." A pause. "If this is what it looks like, I know what it looks like," I said. "I want to know what it is." She called me back the following morning. What the payments were, she explained, was not embezzlement in the technical sense. Nathan had the authority to approve vendor expenses within his divisional budget, so the transactions were formally within his power. What they appeared to be was something closer to a sweetheart arrangement, a consulting firm that existed primarily on paper, with principals who, when Margaret dug into the corporate registration, were connected to a man Nathan had known since his early social days in Chicago, a man who moved in the expensive circles Nathan had been performing membership in for years. Money going out, not much coming back in. Not fraud, technically, but not honest either. That distinction between what is technically permissible and what is actually right had been the operational principle of my business for 40 years. You can build something that looks clean from certain angles and is rotten at the core. I had spent 4 decades refusing to do that, and now I was sitting across from evidence that my son had not learned the same lesson. "What do you want to do?" Margaret asked. I was quiet for a moment. Through the window of my Evanston kitchen, the December sky had given way to January, pale, flat, the color of exhaustion. The lavender in the doorway had faded to gray stalks and memory. "Document everything," I said. "All of it. I want a complete picture before I make any decision." "And Nathan?" "Nathan is still dealing with the 60 days," I said. "He has enough to think about." Go. He appeared at my door on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks into the notice period. I had not invited him. He had texted that morning, not asking exactly, just announcing, "I'm coming by this afternoon. We need to talk in person." I had not responded, which he apparently chose to interpret as consent. He looked different than he had at the dinner table. It had only been 3 weeks, but 3 weeks without the scaffolding he'd built his life around had done something visible to him. He was wearing clothes that didn't fit the occasion particularly well. A good coat still, but underneath it a sweater that was slightly wrong, the kind of small misalignment that happens when someone used to having everything arranged for them suddenly has to arrange things themselves. His face was tired. Not devastated, just tired. The performance was still there, but it was running on less energy than usual. I let him in. I did not offer coffee immediately. I let him stand in the hallway of the house he'd grown up in and find his bearings, because I was not trying to be unkind, and I was also not going to manage his comfort for him. He looked around the house the way people look at places from their childhood when they are adults and afraid, taking inventory, looking for something familiar to anchor themselves. "You kept Dad's chair," he said, from the doorway of the sitting room. "I kept everything worth keeping," I said. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. I put the kettle on because it was the right thing to do, not because I was softening. There's a difference. "Victoria and I are staying at a hotel," he said. "The Marriott on Michigan. It's fine. It's temporary." He said that last word like he was trying to convince himself of something. "I know," I said. He looked up at me. "How do you know?" "Nathan, I've been managing financial operations for 40 years. Knowing where things are is what I do." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The hotel is $600 a night." I said nothing. "We can't. I have some personal savings, personal accounts that are actually mine, but they're not." He stopped, and something moved across his face that looked like shame, although I had learned by then to be careful about reading Nathan's expressions, because he had grown up in a household that valued emotional literacy, and he knew what shame was supposed to look like even when what he was actually feeling was something more complicated. "I've been calling around, about positions, at other companies." "Good," I said. He blinked. "That's all? Good? What would you like me to say?" He pressed his hands flat on the table, the way he used to do when he was a teenager trying to have a difficult conversation. "Some things don't change. I'd like you to say this has gone far enough. I'd like you to say you've made your point and now we can figure out a way forward that doesn't involve my wife and me living in a hotel on my savings while you—" He stopped himself. "While I what?" He met my eyes. "While you sit here in this house like nothing happened." I set 2 cups on the table and sat down across from him. I looked at my son, really looked at him, the way I had been doing since that night at the dinner table when I finally stopped looking at the version of him I wanted to see and started looking at the one that was actually there. "Nathan," I said, "do you know what that consulting firm in Delaware is?" The shift in his face was small. Anyone else might have missed it. I did not miss it. What consulting firm? He said. And that was when I understood the full picture. Not because the question told me something new, because the way he asked it, the half second before the words, the very slight reconstruction of his expression, told me he knew exactly which firm I meant and had been hoping I hadn't found it yet. The one you've been routing vendor payments to for 14 months, I said. The one registered to a Delaware holding company that connects back to a man named Derek Holt, who I understand you've known since your Wicker Park social days about 6 years ago. Nathan's hand, still flat on the table, went very still. The payments are within your divisional authority, I continued. Technically. But I think you know the documentation wouldn't survive an honest review, and I think you've known that for a while. He didn't say anything for a long moment. The kettle clicked off. Neither of us moved. It was consulting work, he said finally. Derek has connections in the Southeast Freight Corridor that we were trying to develop. Did those connections produce anything? A beat. These things take time. 14 months is time, Nathan. He looked away. Out the kitchen window at the January yard, the bare tree Robert had planted the year we moved in, now tall enough that its upper branches were out of frame. He looked at it for a long time, and I watched him, and the kitchen was very quiet. I got in over my head, he said. It came out flat and without drama, which was how I knew it was true. Nathan's performances were elaborate. His honesty, when it came, was always plain. With the image of it, the lifestyle, all of it, things cost more than I let on. And Derek had a proposal that seemed like a way to... He stopped. To make money off the company while making it look like business expenses, I said. He didn't confirm it. He also didn't deny it. He just kept looking at the tree. Victoria doesn't know, he said, about the firm, about how bad the finances actually are. What does Victoria know? He turned back from the window. His face had a quality I hadn't seen in a long time, not since he was very young and had done something genuinely wrong and knew I had found out. Not performance, not management. Just the raw, undefended look of someone who has been caught at the thing they most hope to hide. She knows we have money, he said. She's always known that. She doesn't ask where it comes from. And there it was. Not just Nathan's failure, but the architecture of a marriage built on the same foundation as everything else. The assumption that the money would always be there because it always had been, without any of the work or honesty or accountability that actually keeps money there. Victoria had married a man she believed was wealthy, and Nathan had let her believe it, and the wealth she had married was mine, and nobody in that arrangement had thought clearly about what happened when the foundation shifted. I'm not going to pursue the firm formally, I said. Nathan's eyes came back to me, sharp and searching. Not at this time, but it will be part of the governance documentation. If there is any recurrence of anything like it, under any circumstances, that decision changes. He nodded. A single, short nod. And I need the full accounting, I said. Every payment, every communication with Derek Holt, everything documented and turned over to Margaret's office. Not negotiable. Okay, he said quietly. The word was so small. So unlike the Nathan who had sat at the head of that table with his wine and his managed smile and his careful speech about practical arrangements, this was someone else entirely. Or maybe not someone else. Maybe just the person under the performance, the person I hadn't been able to reach through all the years of managing and protecting and quietly solving problems before they became visible. Maybe this was the Nathan who had always been there, waiting for conditions that made pretending impossible. I pushed the tea across the table to him. He wrapped his hands around the cup. I built everything in this family, I said, not as an accusation, as a fact. Not because I wanted to hold it over you, because I wanted you to have a different starting point than I did. I didn't want you to know what hungry felt like, or what scared felt like, when a contract falls through and you don't know how you're going to make payroll. I stopped. But somewhere in giving you all of that, I forgot to give you the part that made it mean something. He was looking at me now. The fear is important, I said. I know that sounds like something someone says when they've never had to be afraid. But the fear is where the real decisions come from. The choices you make when no one is cushioning the fall, those are the choices that tell you who you actually are. Nathan's jaw worked. He looked down at the tea. And who am I? He asked. It was barely above a whisper. "I don't know yet," I said honestly, "but I think you're about to find out." He left an hour later. He walked down the front path in his good coat and his wrong sweater, and he didn't look back at the house, and I watched him from the doorway until he reached the car and got in, and then I stood there for a moment in the cold air looking at the street. I was not sure I had reached him. I was not sure a single conversation, even an honest one, could undo the habits of a decade. People are not problems you can solve in an afternoon, even people you love, even people you built your whole life around. But something had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before you can name it. Something structural, something in the actual grain of who he was and who he might become. Victoria called that evening again. This time the message was shorter, less calculated. She said Nathan had come home and told her about the firm, and she needed to understand what was real, and could I please call her back? I noticed she said home, not the hotel. Even in crisis, she still called the $600 room home. I did not call her back that night, not because I was cruel, but because Victoria's reckoning was a separate one, and it was not mine to manage. What happened between Nathan and Victoria, when there was no money cushioning the space between who they each actually were, that was their work to do, not mine. What I could do, what I had already done by then, was stop carrying a weight that had never been mine to carry in the first place. The company I had built was still intact. The properties were in order. My finances were clean and fully documented, as they had always been, because I was someone who understood that the day you stop paying attention to the details is the day the details start paying attention to you. Everything I had was still exactly where it was supposed to be. The question was no longer about what I owned. It had never really been about that. The question was whether my son, stripped of every comfort I had quietly provided, stripped of the image and the accounts and the car and the penthouse and the performance, whether the person standing at the bottom of all that stripped-away scaffolding was someone who could build something real. I had made sure he would have to answer that question now. Whether he had the character to answer it honestly was the thing I could not control, could not engineer, could not protect him into. All I could do was what I had been unable to do for 30 years. Let him fall all the way down so he could find out for himself what he was made of. I did not hear from Nathan for 11 days after he left my kitchen. 11 days of silence from a man who had been calling me 3 times a day for the 3 weeks prior. I noticed the shift the way you notice when a persistent sound stops. Not with relief exactly, but with a kind of held attention, waiting to understand what the quiet meant. Margaret told me, through the documentation process, that Nathan had vacated the penthouse 4 days before the 60-day notice technically expired. He had arranged movers himself, paid for them out of his personal savings, and cleared the apartment without contacting the building management company for anything beyond the standard checkout procedure. No disputes, no requests for extensions, no dramatic gestures. I found that more meaningful than anything he had said in my kitchen. What he took with him fit into a modest moving truck. That was the detail that stayed with me, not as a source of satisfaction, because I was not in the business of feeling satisfied about my son's losses, but as a measure of what had actually been his all along. When you strip away the company furniture, the company art, the items purchased on corporate accounts that technically belonged to Whitmore Global Freight's balance sheet, what Nathan Whitmore owned personally was a truck's worth of belongings. He was 39 years old. Victoria, I learned through Margaret's contacts, had gone to stay with her sister in Naperville. The phrasing in the brief message she apparently sent Nathan was something along the lines of needing space to think. I had expected this. Victoria was not a person who had married difficulty. She had married the appearance of ease, and now that the ease had been revealed as borrowed, she was recalculating. I did not blame her entirely. I also did not feel the need to feel sorry for her. She had made her own choices, and the choices were catching up to her at the same rate they were catching up to everyone else. Nathan was living somewhere I didn't know. That was new. In 39 years, I had always known where my son was. I sat with that discomfort and did not do anything about it. The call I did not expect came on a Wednesday morning in late January, from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. I'm glad I did. "Mrs. Whitmore?" A woman's voice. Professional, slightly careful. "My name is Patricia Osei. I'm the operations director at Lakefront Distribution Center in Cicero. I apologize for contacting you directly. I got your number through an industry contact. I wanted to reach out about something, and I wasn't sure the right way to do it. I set down the report I'd been reviewing. Go ahead. We have a new employee, she said. He came to us about 3 weeks ago, applied under the name Ethan Carter. A pause. He listed no prior employment. He said he'd been out of the workforce for a few years dealing with a family situation. We normally wouldn't take someone on with that kind of gap, but he was very straightforward in the interview. Didn't oversell himself. We put him on night inventory. I was quiet. He's been doing well, Patricia continued. Better than well, actually. Mrs. Whitmore, he flagged a routing inefficiency in our third bay system 2 weeks in that our logistics team had been sitting on for 8 months. He wrote it up by hand and left it on my desk. No fanfare, just, here's the problem, here's a possible solution, let me know if this is useful. Another pause. I put it through. It's working. I got up from the table and walked to the kitchen window without being conscious of deciding to move. Why are you calling me? I asked. Because when I looked more closely at Ethan Carter, she said carefully, the face and the age and some of the details in the way he talks about logistics. I've been in this industry for a long time, Mrs. Whitmore. I've seen your son's name in trade publications. I did some reading. A beat. I'm not calling to cause any trouble. I want to be clear about that. I'm calling because I think you should know where he is, and I think you should know that whatever is happening with your family, he's not sitting somewhere feeling sorry for himself. He's working. I looked at the bare tree in the January yard for a long time. Thank you for calling me, I said finally. He doesn't know I called, she said quickly, and I won't tell him. I appreciate that. After we hung up, I stood at the window for a long time. The bare tree, the gray sky, the bird feeder, still full, though the cardinal hadn't been back in weeks. Ethan Carter. He had used his middle name and his maternal grandmother's maiden name. He had constructed the smallest possible fiction. Not a full alias, not an elaborate deception, just enough to step out of the shadow of Nathan Whitmore and be evaluated as a person rather than a name. And then he had shown up and done the work. I did not call him. I did not go to the distribution center. I had not earned the right to observe him yet, and I knew it. What I did was go back to the reports on my desk and keep working, but something had shifted in the quality of the silence between us. It was still silence, but it was a different kind. The months that followed were the strangest of my professional life, and my professional life has included a government audit, a hostile acquisition attempt, and a winter storm that grounded half our carrier fleet for 6 days during the highest volume period of the fiscal year. I know, strange. This was different. I was running Whitmore Global Freight again, fully and actively, for the first time in years, and I found, to my own surprise, that I was good at it in ways I had forgotten I was good at it. Not because I had gotten better, I hadn't particularly, because I had gotten out of the habit of apologizing for it. When you step back from something you've built to make room for someone else, there is a way that the stepping back can become its own kind of posture. You start to perform the role of the person who isn't there anymore. You defer in meetings you once ran. You soften opinions you once stated plainly. You tell yourself it's generosity, making space, letting the next generation find their footing. And some of that is true. But some of it, if you're not careful, is just shrinking, and the person you're shrinking for stops even noticing you're doing it. I stopped shrinking. I ran the board reviews the way I used to run them, directly, with specific expectations and clear accountability. I restructured the divisional authority that Nathan had occupied, distributing it across 3 existing directors who had been doing the real work underneath his oversight for years, and who, when I sat down with each of them individually, had very precise ideas about what had been wrong and how to fix it. I listened to them for hours. I acted on most of what they told me. The company responded the way a plant responds to water after a dry season. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, with a quality of returning to itself that was more satisfying than any single quarter's numbers. I was 70 years old and I was running my company again, and I was not tired. That surprised me more than almost anything. Part 2. Nathan called me for the first time in 6 weeks on a Tuesday evening in February. I was in the sitting room with a book I was actually reading this time. A history of the Transcontinental Railroad that Robert had given me years ago and that I had never gotten around to until now, when my phone lit up with his name. I answered on the third ring. "Hi, Mom." His voice was different again. Not the alarm of the first call after the lease notice, not the flat-controlled anger of the hotel period, not even the stripped-bare honesty of the kitchen conversation. This was something else. Quieter. More settled, somehow, in a way that was hard to name. "Hi," I said. "I'm not calling to argue," he said immediately. I wanted to call, that's all." I closed the book and set it on the side table. "Okay." A silence, but not an uncomfortable one, more like the kind of silence that happens when two people haven't spoken in a while and are finding their way back to the register. "I'm working," he said. "I know you probably know that." I didn't confirm or deny it. "It's different," he said. "The work is different. I'm not going to pretend it's easy. It's not. The hours are bad and it's physical in a way I wasn't prepared for, and there are people there who figured out pretty quickly that I don't actually know how to do a lot of the things they do." A pause. "That was a hard week. When they figured that out." "What happened?" I asked. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "There's a guy named Franklin. He's been working nights at the same distribution center for 11 years. He knows every inch of that facility. And I came in acting like I was going to figure things out fast because I understand logistics, right? I know the industry." And Franklin watched me for about 4 days, and then he said, very politely, "Ethan, you know a lot about how this industry looks on paper. You should maybe spend some time learning how it actually works." "Franklin sounds useful," I said. "Franklin is the most competent person I've ever worked next to," Nathan said. "And he makes about $42,000 a year, and his company health insurance has a $4,000 deductible, and he told me that with zero resentment. He just told me, like it was a fact he'd long ago made peace with." A pause. "I've been thinking about that a lot." I didn't fill the silence. I let it sit. "I used to look at people like Franklin," Nathan said, and I could hear the discomfort in his voice. The specific discomfort of self-examination that has gone far enough to produce actual honesty rather than managed reflection. And I thought I understood what their lives were. I thought I knew what it meant to work hard. I thought I did, Mom. I genuinely thought I did. "I know you did," I said. "I was wrong about what that meant." "Yes," I said. "You were." Another silence. I heard something in the background that sounded like a small space, the particular acoustics of someone sitting in an apartment without much furniture. "Where are you living?" I asked. "A one-bedroom in Berwyn," he said. "It's fine. The heat is a little unreliable. I've got a space heater." He said it without self-pity, which was the part that got to me. Not the information, the matter-of-fact quality of it. Like he was reporting a thing, not performing a thing. "You're managing?" I asked. "Yeah, a beat. It's the first time in my life I've paid rent with money I earned by showing up somewhere and doing a thing that needed doing. And I know how that sounds at 39 years old. I know." His voice had a roughness at the edges now. "But it's true." I took a breath. "Nathan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Okay." "The firm, Derek Holt. Have you had any contact with him since the governance documentation?" A pause, shorter than I expected. "No, I ended it before the documentation. The week after I came to your house, I called him and told him the arrangement was over." A beat. "He wasn't happy about it." "Did he threaten anything?" "He implied things. Nothing specific." Another pause. "I think he understood that any noise he made would land worse on him than on me once the documentation existed. Men like Derek are careful about that." I believed him. Not because I always believed Nathan, but because the specific texture of the answer, the detail about Derek's reaction, the reasoning about the documentation, was the kind of answer you give when you're reporting what actually happened rather than constructing what you want someone to hear. "Good," I said. "Mom," his voice shifted. "I've been thinking about what you said in the kitchen, about the fear being important." A pause. I think I understand it now in a way I didn't then, because I was scared that day in your kitchen. I was scared about losing things, the hotel, the money, the position. I was scared about what people were going to think of me. He stopped. Now I'm scared about different things. I'm scared about whether I'm actually good enough to do something real, whether there's enough in me, the actual me, to build anything that matters. That fear, I said, is the right fear. It doesn't feel better. It's not supposed to feel better. It's supposed to make you move. He was quiet for a moment. Victoria filed for a legal separation last week, he said. She has a lawyer. I had been waiting for that news. I know, Margaret flagged it. I think she blamed me for lying about the finances, which is fair. Another beat. She also told me before the lawyer got involved that she had always known things were different than I said they were, and she had just decided not to ask because asking would have made it real. A pause. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it right now, I said. You have enough to carry. Yeah. The word came out tired and genuine and very young, and for a moment I could hear in it the 9-year-old boy with the fever, the teenager who lost a friendship and wouldn't explain why, the 29-year-old at the airport after his father died, and I felt the weight of all of those versions of him stacked on top of each other like sediment. Are you eating? I asked. He laughed, a real one, short and a little surprised. Yes, Mom. I'm eating. Are you sleeping? Badly. The space heater makes noise. I have a spare space heater, I said. A quiet one. I'll leave it on the porch. A long pause. You don't have to do that. Nathan. I picked up my book again, though I wasn't planning to read it. I'm your mother, not your adversary. I never was. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful in the way it gets when someone is managing an emotion they're not ready to name out loud. I know, he said. I'm starting to understand what that actually means. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing important. The space heater, the distribution center, a book he'd found at a thrift store in Berwyn that he was reading on his lunch breaks. Small things. The kind of conversation we had not been able to have for years because we had been too busy performing versions of ourselves at each other to actually talk. After we hung up, I sat in Robert's chair for a while in the lamp-lit quiet of the house and thought about the conversation with a kind of careful attention, turning it over, looking at it from different angles, the way I look at any significant data point before deciding what it means. What I concluded was this. The man I had spoken to tonight was not the finished version of Nathan Whitmore. He was not redeemed, not transformed, not arrived at some new place of character and wisdom. He was someone in the middle of something hard, doing the work, making mistakes he was no longer hiding, feeling things he was no longer managing for an audience. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the most important thing I had seen from him in years. Patricia Osei called me again in early March. He's been promoted, she said, without preamble. Unofficially. I haven't given him a title yet because I want to see if it holds, but he's essentially running coordination for 2 of our 3 bays, and he's doing it well. Better than well. A pause. He's also been spending time with our driver teams. Voluntarily. Riding along on early morning routes on his days off to understand the ground-level operation. I thought of Robert, climbing down from a truck cab with bad knees, tired in the specific way of someone whose work lives in their body. He doesn't know you and I have spoken? I asked. No, and I've kept it that way. Thank you, Patricia. Mrs. Whitmore. She paused. I've been doing this for a long time. I've seen a lot of people come through facilities like mine, some on the way up, some on the way down, some who never figure out which direction they're going. Your son, she stopped, seeming to choose her words. He reminds me of someone who's been looking at a map upside down for a long time and finally figured out which way is north. After we hung up, I went to the window again. The bare tree was beginning to show the faintest suggestion of buds. Still weeks from anything you could call growth, but there, if you knew what to look for. I had been building things my entire life. Companies, systems, supply chains, relationships. I knew what the early stages looked like. I knew how to tell the difference between something that was coming to life and something that was merely not yet dead. What I was seeing in Nathan was not certainty. It was not resolution. It was the very beginning of something that might become real under the right conditions, with enough time and enough honesty and enough of the particular discomfort that real growth always involves. But it was there. After 40 years of building things with my hands and my attention and my stubborn refusal to accept that something was impossible when it was merely very difficult, I knew what a foundation looked like when it was finally being laid on solid ground. I knew because I had spent my life learning the difference between what looks sturdy and what actually holds weight. And I knew because I was his mother, and some things you know not from data but from the long, complicated, imperfect territory of having loved someone through every version they have ever been. I stood at the window for a while longer, then I went back to work. The cyber attack hit on a Thursday morning in late October, almost 10 months after Nathan had walked out of my kitchen in his good coat and his wrong sweater. I was in a board review when the first alert came through, a cascading failure in the digital logistics network that managed routing and carrier communication across 4 of our regional distribution hubs. By the time I stepped out of the meeting to take the call from our head of operations, the failure had spread to 6 hubs. By the time I reached my office, it was all 9. The attack was sophisticated. Not random ransomware thrown at a soft target, but something deliberate and layered, aimed at the specific architecture of our tracking and communication systems in a way that suggested whoever was responsible had spent time understanding how those systems were connected. Our IT security team was on it within the hour, but within that first hour, the damage was already significant. Thousands of active shipments with no reliable routing data, carrier communications down, clients calling with no information to give them, drivers in the field with no updated instructions. I had lived through disruptions before: weather events, equipment failures, labor disputes. I knew what a company looked like under that kind of pressure. What I saw in my operations team that morning was controlled. They were professionals. They were working the problem. But underneath the control was a particular quality of overwhelm that comes when a problem is bigger than any individual piece of the response. Our chief technology officer, a careful man named David Park, who had been with the company for 12 years, came to my office at 10 in the morning and sat down across from me with the expression of someone about to deliver a number they don't want to say out loud. "Best case," he said, "we're looking at 72 hours to restore full digital operations. That's assuming we contain the breach today and the backup systems hold." "Worst case?" I asked. 5 to 7 days. He paused, "during which we have no reliable automated routing for any active shipment. Everything goes manual, which means we need someone who can design a manual recovery system fast enough to be operational within 24 hours, I said. "Before we lose clients we can't afford to lose, and before the drivers in the field start making decisions without coordination." David looked at me with the expression of a man who knows what the right answer is and is not sure if he's allowed to say it. "There's a theoretical framework for that kind of system," he said carefully. "Old-school logistics, pre-digital, route cards, physical manifests, hub-to-hub phone trees. But designing it for our current scale, mapping it to our actual carrier network and active shipment load." He shook his head. "That's a week of work, minimum. We don't have a week." I looked at him for a moment. Then I reached for my phone and called Patricia Osi. She picked up on the second ring. "Patricia," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "Of course." "Ethan Carter," I said, "if you gave him a significant problem today, a real one, with actual stakes, what would he do with it?" A pause. Not a long one. "He'd work it," she said. "He'd stay until it was done. And I think, Mrs. Whitmore, in the last few months I have watched that man map our entire physical distribution network on paper just because he wanted to understand it, not because anyone asked him to, because he couldn't stand not knowing how the whole thing fit together." Another pause. "Is this about the attack?" "You've heard." "Industry news travels fast. What do you need?" "I need him here," I said, "if he's willing." A silence. "I'll talk to him," she said. "But Mrs. Whitmore, if he comes, he should know it's you. He shouldn't walk into that building not knowing." She was right. I knew she was right. "Tell him," I said. "Tell him everything, and then let him decide." He arrived at the Whitmore Global Freight headquarters at 2 in the afternoon. I was in the operations center when he came through the door, and I watched him from across the room before he saw me, because I wanted a moment to see him as Patricia had been seeing him. Not as my son, not as the man from the penthouse, not as the person I was still in the process of forgiving and being forgiven by, but simply as a person walking into a room. He looked like someone who had been working with his body. Not dramatically different. He was still Nathan, still had the same face I had been looking at for 39 years. But there was a physical quality to the way he held himself that hadn't been there before. A groundedness. He wasn't performing the entrance. He just walked in, looked around at the operations center with its multiple screens and the cluster of stressed people and the particular contained chaos of a company in crisis. And his face did the thing that good logistics minds do automatically. It started organizing what it was seeing. He saw me. His expression shifted into something careful and genuine at the same time. He crossed the room. "Mom," he said. "Nathan," I said. We looked at each other for a moment. There was too much between us for a brief exchange to carry, and we both knew it, so we didn't try. "Tell me what happened," he said. "All of it." I told him. David walked him through the technical specifics. Nathan listened in a way I had not often seen him listen. Fully, without the half-attention of someone composing their response while the other person is still talking. He asked specific questions, the kind that told me he was building a picture rather than confirming a story he'd already decided on. When we were done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I use a conference room? I need about 4 hours and someone who can pull up the physical carrier contracts. The paper ones, the originals, not the digital summaries." David looked at me. I nodded. "4th floor," I said. "I'll have someone bring you what you need." He started to turn, then stopped. "Mom." He looked at me directly. "I'm not here because you called. I came because you called, but I want you to know that what I do in that room, I'm going to do because it's the right problem to solve. Not because of anything between us." "I know," I said. "I just needed to say that." "I know that too," I said. He held my gaze for another second, and then he went. What happened over the next 18 hours is the part of this story I have told the least, because the people who were there do not need me to tell it, and the people who weren't there would need more context than I have patience to provide. But I will tell it now, because it is the part that matters most, and I have spent too much of this story being careful about what I say. Nathan did not sleep. He worked through the night with 2 members of our carrier relations team, 2 women named Gwen and Alma, who had been with the company for 8 and 11 years respectively, and who I was told afterward had initially been skeptical about who this person was and where he'd come from, and who had been fully converted by about midnight when they understood that he actually knew what he was doing. What he built was not elegant. I want to be honest about that, because the versions of stories like this that you hear tend to describe the solution as some kind of inspired brilliance that arrives fully formed. That is not what happened. What happened was 10 hours of grinding, unglamorous, detail-intensive work, mapping our active carrier network by hand, cross-referencing physical contracts with known driver territories, building a phone tree system from our existing personnel directory that could function as a routing communication backup, creating a paper manifest system that could track shipment status without digital infrastructure. It was the kind of work that requires you to know the difference between how a logistics system is supposed to work and how it actually works on the ground. The former is something you can learn from documents. The latter is something you learn by riding along on early morning routes on your days off because you couldn't stand not knowing. By 4 in the morning, the manual recovery system had a skeleton. By 7, it had enough structure to be functional. By 9, Gwen and Alma were training operations staff on it, while Nathan sat in the conference room with a cold cup of coffee and a legal pad covered in his handwriting, going back through the map he'd built, looking for gaps. I came in at 6:30. I had gone home for 3 hours and slept badly, and come back because there was nowhere else I was going to be that morning. I stood in the doorway of the conference room for a moment before he saw me. The table was covered in papers. The whiteboard on the wall had a network diagram on it, carrier codes and route numbers and hub identifiers in Nathan's handwriting, color-coded with 3 different markers. The diagram was not beautiful. It was functional and dense, and looked like the work of someone who had been thinking very hard for a very long time. He looked up. "There are 3 gaps in the southeast corridor," he said, without preamble. "Carriers 41 and 47 have overlapping territory but no coordination protocol between them. If we lose communication with the Joliet hub for more than 6 hours, those routes go dark." He tapped the legal pad. "I've drafted a contingency for it, but we need someone to make calls to both carrier contacts before 8 to make sure they're briefed." "I'll have Gwen handle it," I said. He nodded, looked back at the papers. I walked to the table and sat down across from him. The same configuration as the kitchen in Evanston, except that the kitchen had been about what he had taken, and this room was about what he was giving, and the difference between those two things was not lost on either of us. "The system will hold?" I asked. "For 48 to 72 hours. Maybe more if David's team can restore partial digital function to the Midwest hubs first, and we can prioritize routing from there." He paused. "It's not a permanent solution. It's a bridge." "A bridge is what we need." He looked at me then, really looked. The same way I had looked at him the night of the dinner, past the surface to whatever was underneath. His face was tired and unshaved, and there was a mark on his forearm from where he'd been leaning on the table for hours, a red pressure line that he hadn't noticed. "How bad is the client exposure?" he asked. "Manageable if we can communicate proactively today." I paused. "Which we can, now that we have something coherent to tell them." He nodded slowly. "Okay." He picked up the coffee, realized it was cold, set it back down. "Okay." We sat there for a moment in the quiet of the conference room, the first quiet that room had probably seen in 20 hours. "Nathan," I said, "this is good work." He looked at the table. "It needed doing. That's not what I said." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Yeah." The word was simple, not performed, not managed, just received. "Thank you." The recovery took 61 hours. David's team restored partial digital function to 4 hubs by the end of the first day, and Nathan's manual system handled the remaining load with less disruption than anyone in the operations center had considered possible when the attack first hit. We lost 2 clients, a smaller retailer and a regional manufacturer who had been looking for a reason to consolidate vendors anyway. We kept every major contract. The board was briefed. The communication to our carriers and partners was handled directly and without euphemism, which was the only way I knew how to handle it. On the 3rd day, when the last of the digital systems came back online and the operations center had returned to its normal hum, I asked Nathan to come to my office. He sat across from me in the chair that faced my desk. Not Robert's chair. The chair that clients sat in, that board members sat in, that people sat in when there was real business to discuss. He sat in it the way someone sits when they are not sure whether they are being evaluated or invited, and I understood that uncertainty and decided to address it directly. "I have a proposal," I said. He waited. "There's a position open in this company," I said. "Director of Ground Operations Resilience. It doesn't exist yet. I'm creating it based on what I've seen in the last 72 hours. The role oversees our physical contingency systems, our carrier relationships at the ground level, and our manual backup protocols for exactly the kind of event we just went through." I paused. "The pay is fair. Not executive level, not warehouse level, director level, because that is what the work requires." Nathan looked at me for a long moment. His expression was careful in a way that I recognized. Not the managed carefulness of his old performance, but the genuine kind, the kind that means someone is making sure they understand something correctly before they respond. "Is this because of what happened this week?" he asked. "It's because of what I've seen over the last 10 months, I said. This week was confirmation, not cause. Are you offering me this because I'm your son? I'm offering you this, I said, because I need someone in this role who understands the difference between how a logistics system looks on paper and how it works at 4 in the morning when the digital infrastructure is gone and you've got 47 active routes with no automated coordination. You are the only person I know who has spent the last 10 months acquiring exactly that understanding. The fact that you are my son is a complication we would both have to manage, and I trust that we can manage it." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside my office window, the Chicago skyline was bright and cold. an early November clarity that made everything look sharper than it actually was. "I want to earn it," he said finally. "I don't mean that as a condition. I mean it as, I need you to know that I'm not coming back here to take something. If I do this, I'm going to work it the way I've been working the last 10 months. And if I'm not good enough, I want you to tell me." "I've been telling you the truth for 10 months, I said. "I don't plan to stop." Something shifted in his face. Not relief. Something more complicated than relief. The particular expression of a person who has spent a long time in the cold and has just stepped into a space that is warm, but is still adjusting to the change in temperature. "Okay," he said. "Yes. But I need to tell you about the dinner. Not immediately. Not that week. Not that month. It took another 8 months, the full weight of a year, before the dinner happened. And when it did, it was nothing like the one in December that started all of this. It was at the house in Evanston. My house, Robert's house. The house with the dried lavender in the kitchen doorway and the bird feeder in the yard and the chair that I had kept because some things are too meaningful to throw away, even when they're impractical. I cooked. Not because I felt obligated to, but because I wanted to. Because there is something in the act of making food in a kitchen you know by heart for people you love that cannot be replicated by a catered menu and charcoal linen napkins, and I had known that my entire life, and the dinners I had brought sweet potato casserole to in foil pans were always my attempt to put that truth on someone else's table. This time, the table was mine. Nathan came alone. The separation from Victoria had become a divorce, finalized in the spring, concluded without the kind of acrimony that happens when both people are surprised by what was always true. Victoria had, in the end, surprised me slightly. She had taken less than I expected, made fewer demands than her lawyer had initially suggested, and sent me a brief, unembellished note 3 weeks after the proceedings were done, saying that she was sorry for her part in what had happened, and that she hoped Nathan and I would find our way back to each other. It was 3 sentences long. It was probably the most honest thing she had ever communicated to me. I kept the note. Nathan arrived at 6 with a bottle of wine he had picked out himself. Not an impressive bottle, not a statement bottle, just something he thought I would like. A California Red I had mentioned once in passing that I'd enjoyed at a restaurant years ago. He had remembered. He had gone and found it. That was the thing about Nathan when he was paying attention. He had always been capable of that quality of care. He had just spent a decade directing it mostly toward impressing people who didn't know him well enough to value it. We ate dinner the way families eat dinner when they are not performing dinner. In pieces, getting up to refill things, talking about other things while the food sat, letting the meal be the background rather than the occasion. He told me about a project he was developing at the company, a physical resilience protocol that he wanted to build into every regional hub, a kind of standing manual system that would run parallel to the digital infrastructure rather than existing only as an emergency backup. If we'd had it before October, he said, cutting a piece of bread that was slightly overdone at the edges because I had been distracted by the conversation when the timer went off, the attack would have been a significant inconvenience instead of a crisis. "Bring me the proposal when it's ready," I said. "I want to walk it by Gwen and Alma first," he said. "They know the ground-level realities better than I do. I don't want to build something that looks right on paper and falls apart when Franklin tries to use it at 4 in the morning." I looked at my son across my kitchen table, eating slightly overdone bread without comment, talking about the people who actually did the work with the tone of someone who genuinely respected them. And I thought, there you are. There is the person I was trying to raise. Not the finished version, not the redeemed version from a story where everything resolves cleanly and everyone learns their lesson on schedule. Just a man in his late 30s who had been through something that cost him nearly everything he thought he was, and was building something new from what remained, carefully, with the specific humility of someone who has learned that humility is not a performance, but a practice. He was not perfect. I want to be clear about that too, because this story is not a fable, and Nathan Whitmore is not a fable character. He was still sometimes impatient with people who moved slower than he did. He was still learning how to receive feedback without his first instinct being to defend himself. There were moments at work where the old habits surfaced, the tendency to lead with confidence before he had earned it, the reflexive reach for authority when collaboration would have served better. We had difficult conversations, not screaming matches, not dramatic confrontations, just the ordinary difficult conversations that happen between two people who are trying to work together honestly after a long period of not being honest with each other. Those conversations were hard. They were also the best evidence I had that something real was being built between us, because the only relationships that require that kind of ongoing honesty are the ones that are actually trying to be something. After dinner, we sat in the living room, me in Robert's chair, Nathan on the couch he had grown up sleeping on during sick days. And we talked for another hour about things that had nothing to do with the company or the past year or any of the events that had brought us to this particular evening. He asked me about Robert, not in the way he used to ask, the brief, dutiful references to his father that felt like an obligation, but really asked, what had Robert been like when Nathan was very small, before Nathan could remember clearly? What Robert had thought about the company in the early years, whether Robert had ever been afraid. All the time, I said. He hid it better than I did, but yes. Nathan was quiet for a moment, looking at the chair I was sitting in. I think about him more now, he said, than I used to. I think about what he would say about all of this. What do you think he would say? He considered it for a moment. Not quickly. The real consideration, the kind that takes a minute and doesn't produce a polished answer. I think he would say something short, Nathan said finally. Something that sounded simple but wasn't. That was how he was, right? He didn't make speeches. He made speeches occasionally, I said. He just made them count. Nathan smiled, a real one, the kind that reaches the eyes. Yeah. He looked down at the wine in his glass. I think he would tell me I was about 35 years late to a conversation I should have had with myself a long time ago. A pause. And then he would probably make me help him with something in the yard because he didn't like people sitting with uncomfortable thoughts for too long without giving them something physical to do. I laughed. I did not expect to laugh, and the surprise of it was its own kind of gift. That is exactly what he would have done, I said. We sat with that for a while, with Robert's presence in the room, in the chair, in the bird feeder in the yard that I still kept filled for a cardinal that had no obligation to return but sometimes did. With the weight of missing him and the strange comfort of missing him together, which was something Nathan and I had never quite managed before because grief, like most things, requires a certain honesty to share. Before he left, Nathan stood in the kitchen doorway, the way he used to stand as a child when he wanted to say something but hadn't decided how yet. I was wrapping up the leftovers and pretending not to notice. "Mom," he said. I turned. "I know I haven't said this in a way that was worth saying," he said. "I've said versions of it. I've said I'm sorry. I've said I understand. But I want to say something different than that." He stopped and his jaw worked slightly, the way it does when he is not performing and is trying to be precise. "What you did, making me face it, not protecting me from it. I know that couldn't have been easy. I know you're not built to let people you love fall down." He paused. "It was the most honest thing anyone has ever done for me. And it took me a long time to be able to say that without it feeling like I was just saying what you wanted to hear." I set down the leftovers and looked at my son. "I know," I said. "I can tell the difference." He nodded. Something settled in his face. Not relief, but something adjacent to it. The particular quality of a person who has said the true thing and had it received. He put on his coat. He hugged me in the hallway, and it was not the careful, managed hug of the airport or the formal embrace of someone going through the motions of a family feeling. It was the kind of hug that means something, that has weight behind it, that acknowledges everything it is not saying because the saying is not the point. He went down the front path, and I watched from the doorway, the cold coming in around me, and he got to the end and turned back, something he had not done the last time, and raised a hand, and I raised mine back, and then he was gone. I stood in the doorway for a minute. The street was quiet. The November air smelled like wood smoke from somewhere down the block, and the particular clean cold of a city that has finally settled into winter. I thought about that dinner 14 months ago, The marble table and the white candles and the 20 people and the careful speech from my son who believed he had finally learned to tell me the truth and was instead, without knowing it, showing me exactly how far from the truth he had drifted. I thought about standing up from that table and saying, "You're right, no one should take luxury for granted," and the way Nathan had thought, that meant I was accepting the terms. He had not understood then that there is a kind of acceptance that is not surrender. That the woman who gets up quietly and leaves without a scene is not always the woman who has been defeated. Sometimes she is the woman who has finally seen clearly enough to stop protecting someone from what they need to learn. I had spent 39 years being Nathan's mother. I had done it imperfectly, the way every parent does everything, with blind spots and overcompensations and the particular failures that come from loving someone so much that you can't always see them clearly. I had given him too much of the wrong things and not enough of the right ones, and I had known it in some quiet way for years and had kept not doing anything about it, because doing something about it was going to hurt us both. The hurt had been real. I will not minimize it. What it cost Nathan to lose his constructed life was not nothing, and what it cost me to be the one who dismantled it was also not nothing. There were nights in the Evanston house during those months when the silence was very loud, and I sat in Robert's chair and wondered whether I had done the right thing or merely the decisive thing, and I did not always arrive at the answer I wanted. But I want to tell you something, and this is the part I need you to hear, not as the ending of a story, but as the thing the story was actually about all along. You cannot love someone into health. You cannot protect someone into strength. You cannot cushion someone into understanding what they are made of, because the only way to find out what you are made of is to be in a situation where the cushion is gone and you have to find out. I gave Nathan everything I had except the most important thing, the chance to discover what he was worth when he had nothing to prove it with. That is not a failure of love. It is a failure of honesty. The small, daily honesty that says, "I love you enough to let this be hard. I love you enough to stop carrying the weight you need to carry yourself. I love you enough to make the hardest decision instead of the kindest one, because sometimes those are not the same decision, and pretending they are only delays what is coming." If you are reading this and you are in a family where someone you love is taking without seeing, where comfort has become so expected that it is no longer recognized as a gift, where your presence in someone's life has been reduced to what you can provide rather than who you are, hear me when I tell you that drawing a line is not cruelty. Protecting yourself is not betrayal. Saying this ends here is not abandonment. It is sometimes the most loving thing you can do, not because it will definitely fix things. Nothing is that clean, nothing is that guaranteed, and anyone who tells you a hard decision will automatically produce a good outcome is selling you something. Nathan could have gone in a different direction. He could have hardened instead of opened, could have decided the fault was mine and spent the rest of his life in that story. Some people do. The hard decision does not come with a warranty, but it comes with something the soft decision cannot offer, the truth. And truth, even when it is painful, especially when it is painful, is the only foundation that actually holds. I went back inside and closed the door against the cold. The lavender in the kitchen doorway had long since lost its color, just gray stalks holding their shape out of habit. I had been meaning to replace it for 2 years. Tomorrow, I thought, or next week, I would go and find something new to hang in that doorway. But not tonight. Tonight I stood in my kitchen, in the house where I had built my life, and mourned my husband and raised my son and made every significant decision that had shaped the last 40 years, and I let the quiet of it settle around me the way quiet settles in a place that knows you. I had built something, not just the company, not just the properties or the accounts or the financial architecture that had outlasted everyone's assumptions about what a woman starting a freight brokerage out of a basement in Indiana could actually create. I had built a son who was finally, after everything, worth the building. That was enough. That was, if I'm being fully honest with myself and with you, more than enough. It was everything.